The year was 1670 when English settlers first established Charlestown on the Carolina coast. They came with grand ambitions, to create a prosperous colony that would rival Virginia, to grow wealthy on the labor of others, to build a New England in the subtropical wilderness of North America. But Charlestown was different from other English colonies from the very beginning. It was closer to the Caribbean than to New England in spirit and practice. The settlers who came weren't primarily religious dissidents seeking freedom of worship. They were entrepreneurs, younger sons of English gentry seeking fortunes, Barbadian planters looking for new lands to exploit after exhausting their island plantations, and they brought with them the institution that would define Carolina, chattel slavery. In those early years, the enslaved population was diverse. There were Native Americans, captured in wars and raids against the Cherokee, Creek, and Yamasee peoples. There were Africans, brought across the Middle Passage from various regions of West and Central Africa. The plantation system was not yet fully developed, the colony was still finding its economic footing. Some of the early enslaved Africans in Carolina actually gained a measure of autonomy. They worked as cattle herders on the frontier, as boatmen navigating the intricate waterways, as traders dealing with Native American tribes. A few even earned wages and bought their freedom. This was the world before rice. Welcome to Historic Crimes TV, where you get the true story of events that have happened in the past which helped shape the history of the world that we are living in. Before we begin, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. Everything changed in the 1690s when Carolina planters discovered that their swampy lowlands were perfect for growing rice. The crop would transform the colony and doom thousands to unimaginable suffering. Rice cultivation was brutally difficult work. It required flooding and draining fields with precise timing, working in water up to the knees or waist, in heat and humidity that bred mosquitoes carrying malaria and yellow fever. The work was so deadly that white indentured servants died in droves. Even hardened colonists who had survived the passage from England couldn't endure it. But planters knew that in the rice-growing regions of West Africa, particularly in the area the English called the Rice Coast spanning from Senegal to Liberia, people had been cultivating rice for thousands of years. Enslaved Africans from these regions brought with them invaluable knowledge, how to build the complex irrigation systems, when to flood and drain the fields, how to process the rice. The planters became completely dependent on this African knowledge even as they brutalized the people who possessed it. By 1700, Carolina was importing Africans at an unprecedented rate. Ships arrived in Charlestown harbor carrying human cargo, men, women, and children who had survived the nightmare of the Middle Passage, only to face a different nightmare in the rice fields. The demographics began to shift dramatically. By 1708, enslaved Africans outnumbered white colonists. By 1720, the ratio was nearly 2-to-1 in the lowcountry plantation districts. By 1730, it was approaching 3-to-1 in some areas. The white colonists lived in constant fear. They were outnumbered by people they had enslaved, people they brutalized daily, people who had every reason to hate them. This fear would shape every aspect of Carolina society. The enslaved population of Carolina was not monolithic. They came from dozens of different African ethnic groups, spoke different languages, practiced different religions, had different customs and traditions. But slavery forced them into a new identity. They were all enslaved, all treated as property, all subjected to the same brutal system. Among the largest groups were the Angolans from the Kingdom of Congo and surrounding regions. They had been among the first Africans brought to English North America. Many had been captured in the civil wars that followed Portuguese colonization of Angola. Some had military experience. They spoke Kikongo and related languages. The Igbo from the region that is now southeastern Nigeria, they came from societies that valued individual achievement and had complex political systems. They spoke Igbo and brought with them strong cultural traditions that they struggled to maintain in bondage. The Akan from the Gold Coast, modern-day Ghana, including the Coromantee people who had a fierce reputation. English slavers both prized and feared them, knowing them as proud warriors who often resisted enslavement. They spoke Twi and related languages. The men in Temne, from the rice-growing regions of Sierra Leone and surrounding areas, they possessed the agricultural knowledge that made Carolina rice plantations profitable. Ironically, the very skills that made them valuable also made their enslavement more complete. The Fulani and Mandinka, from the interior regions of West Africa, some had been Muslim before their enslavement. They struggled to maintain their faith in a land where reading and writing were forbidden to the enslaved. In the slave quarters of Carolina plantations, these diverse peoples were thrown together. Gradually, painfully, they began to develop a new culture, African American culture, that blended elements from all these traditions with the harsh realities of life in bondage. They created new languages, mixing African grammar with English vocabulary. They blended religious traditions, maintaining African spiritual practices while adopting Christianity. They formed families and communities despite a system designed to destroy both, and they began to organize. In April 1715, the Yamasee people and their Native American allies rose up against the Carolina colonists in a desperate war to drive out the English and reclaim their lands. The Yamasee War came terrifyingly close to destroying the Carolina colony entirely. For the enslaved Africans in Carolina, the war presented both opportunity and danger. Some plantation owners armed their slaves to fight against the Native Americans, a desperate decision that revealed just how precarious the colonists' position was. Enslaved men who had never been allowed to touch a weapon suddenly found themselves with muskets in their hands. But the colonists made sure these weapons were collected again once the war ended. They had learned a frightening lesson: their enslaved workforce could be formidable fighters. They could be organized. They could use weapons effectively. And if they ever united with Native Americans or Spanish enemies, the English colony would be doomed. The Yamasee War intensified white paranoia about slave rebellion. New laws were passed restricting the movement of enslaved people, prohibiting them from assembling, increasing punishments for even minor infractions. But these laws were impossible to fully enforce. There were simply too few white people to watch over too many enslaved people. 70 miles south of Charlestown, across a disputed border that was more theoretical than real, lay Spanish Florida. And in 1693, the Spanish King Carlos II had issued a decree that would reverberate through the Carolina Lowcountry for decades. Any enslaved person who escaped from the English colonies and reached Spanish Florida would be granted freedom if they converted to Catholicism. This decree was partly religious. The Spanish crown was genuinely interested in saving souls, but it was primarily strategic. The Spanish wanted to destabilize the English colonies, drain them of their labor force, and gain valuable intelligence about English military capabilities. In 1738, the Spanish governor of Florida established Fort Mose, also known as Mose, just north of St. Augustine. It was the first free black settlement in what would become the United States, and it was garrisoned by formerly enslaved men who had escaped from Carolina and Georgia. These men were given weapons, military training, and land. They were free. Word of Fort Mose spread through the slave quarters of Carolina like wildfire. It was whispered about in the fields, coded into songs, passed along through the underground networks that connected plantations despite all the colonists' efforts to isolate their enslaved workers from each other. Freedom was possible. Freedom was real. Freedom was just 70 miles south. Men and women began to disappear from Carolina plantations, slipping away in the night to make the dangerous journey to Florida. Some were caught and subjected to horrific punishments, floggings that left permanent scars, brandings, mutilations, executions meant to terrify others into submission. But others made it. Stories filtered back of men who had been slaves and were now free soldiers, of families reunited in freedom. The Carolina planters were enraged. They demanded that the Spanish return their property. The Spanish refused. Tensions escalated. War between England and Spain seemed increasingly likely, and in the slave quarters, men began to plan. The winter of 1738–39 was unusually cold in the Carolina Lowcountry. Ice formed on the edges of the rice fields. Enslaved people huddled in their crude quarters, trying to stay warm with inadequate clothing and no heat beyond small fires that provided more smoke than warmth. But the cold couldn't suppress the whispers of coming war. England and Spain were edging closer to open conflict. The War of Jenkins' Ear, sparked by a bizarre incident where Spanish coast guards had cut off the ear of an English sea captain, would officially begin in October 1739, but everyone knew it was coming. For the enslaved population, war meant opportunity. When white men were distracted by fighting each other, when militias were mobilized to defend against Spanish invasion, when the normal mechanisms of control were disrupted, that was when rebellion became possible. On plantations within 20 miles of the Stono River, a conspiracy began to form. His name appears in the colonial records simply as Jemmy or sometimes Cato, as they so often are when it comes to enslaved people's lives. He was Angolan, probably from the Kingdom of Congo or the surrounding regions that the Portuguese called Angola. Jemmy had been a soldier before his enslavement. In the wars that racked Central Africa in the early 18th century, conflicts fueled by European demand for enslaved people, he had fought for one of the African kingdoms. He knew tactics, formations, and how to command men under fire. These were skills he thought he would never use again when he was captured, chained, forced onto a slave ship, and sold in Charlestown. He had been in Carolina for at least 7 years by 1739, maybe longer. He worked on a plantation near the Stono River, in St. Paul's Parish, about 20 miles from Charlestown. He was valuable property, strong, skilled, seemingly obedient. His owner had no idea that Jemmy spent his nights planning rebellion. Jemmy spoke several languages, his native Kakongo, some Portuguese picked up from traders and missionaries, and broken English learned in bondage. But he also spoke the most important language of all in the slave quarters, the language of resistance. He gathered around him a core group of trusted men, veterans of various African wars, people who remembered freedom and were willing to die to reclaim it. The historical record doesn't preserve most of their names. They appear in colonial documents only as inventory items, as property that was destroyed. But they were real people, with histories and dreams and families. There was a man from the Gold Coast, a Coromantee who had been a warrior before his capture. He was known for his fierce pride and his refusal to be broken by the lash. He bore scars across his back, permanent testimony to his defiance. There was a rice farmer from Sierra Leone, a man who possessed the knowledge that made him valuable but also made him hate his enslavers even more. They profited from his expertise while treating him as subhuman. There was a young man, barely 20, who had been born in Carolina to African parents. He had never known freedom, but he had heard the stories, and he burned with the desire to experience what his parents had lost. There were others, perhaps a dozen men in the inner circle who knew the full extent of the plans, who would lead when the time came. Planning a rebellion required secure communication across multiple plantations, and this was perhaps the most dangerous part of the conspiracy. The Carolina authorities had systems in place to prevent exactly this kind of organization. Enslaved people needed passes to leave their plantations, patrols roamed the roads looking for runaways, and harsh punishments awaited anyone caught in unauthorized assembly. But the enslaved community had developed its own networks, invisible to white eyes. One key venue was the Sunday markets in Charlestown and smaller settlements. Enslaved people were sometimes allowed to sell vegetables from their small garden plots or handicrafts they had made. These markets were one of the few places where enslaved people from different plantations could gather with some degree of legitimacy. At these markets, under the pretense of haggling over produce, messages were passed. A seemingly casual conversation about the weather might actually be coded communication about recruitment. A complaint about a sick chicken might be a warning that a particular area was being heavily patrolled. The conspirators were careful. They never gathered in large groups. They never wrote anything down, most were illiterate anyway, forbidden to learn to read or write. Everything was oral, passed from person to person, memorized carefully because one mistake could mean exposure and death. Enslaved people from multiple plantations sometimes worked together on large projects, clearing new fields, repairing roads, building dikes for rice cultivation. These work gangs provided another opportunity for communication. Jemmy, being a skilled and seemingly trustworthy slave, was sometimes part of work gangs that moved between plantations. This gave him the chance to assess potential recruits, to gauge their willingness to risk everything for freedom. He looked for certain signs: men who still carried themselves with pride despite their bondage, people who had recently arrived from Africa and still remembered freedom, individuals who had been brutally punished and harbored deep hatred for their enslavers, men with military or fighting experience. But he also had to be careful to avoid anyone who might betray the conspiracy, either out of fear or in hopes of winning favor with their master. The complex waterways of the Carolina Lowcountry required skilled boatmen, and many enslaved people worked as oarsmen, fishing boat crews, and river pilots. These boat people moved with relative freedom through the waterways, carrying messages and intelligence far faster than anyone traveling by road. The conspiracy made use of this network. A boatman might carry information from the Stono River area to plantations along the Ashley River, or even into Charlestown itself. The white colonists never suspected that their boatmen were running an intelligence network under their noses. By the summer of 1739, Jemmy and his core conspirators had developed a plan. It was audacious, probably desperate, and had only a slim chance of success. But it was better than remaining in bondage. The rebellion would begin with a raid on Hutchinson's store near the Stono River Bridge. This store was known to stock firearms, gunpowder, and ammunition. Without weapons, the rebellion would be crushed immediately. But if they could arm themselves properly, they would have a fighting chance. The timing had to be perfect. They would strike on a Sunday, when many white colonists would be at church and the store would be lightly guarded or unguarded. The Sunday Sabbath laws, ironically, meant that most plantations did minimal work on Sundays, giving enslaved people more freedom of movement. After seizing the weapons, they would march south along the main road toward Georgia and Spanish Florida. As they marched, they would beat drums, a call to arms that would be heard across the plantations. Enslaved people who heard the drums would have a choice: join the rebellion or stay in bondage. The conspirators hoped that hundreds would join. If they could gather a force of several hundred armed men, they might be able to fight their way through to Florida. The Spanish would welcome them, that much was certain. Fort Mose stood as proof. The route was about 70 miles through enemy territory. It would be extremely dangerous. Carolina militias would pursue them. They might face battles. Some would certainly die. But death in battle for freedom was better than slow death in the rice fields. As they marched, they would attack plantations along the way. This served multiple purposes. It would acquire more weapons and supplies. It would eliminate potential threats at their backs, and it would send a message of terror that would slow the white response. If the colonists were panicking and defending their families, they would be slower to organize an effective pursuit. The conspirators debated this aspect of the plan intensely. Some argued they should avoid unnecessary killing, that they should focus on getting to Florida as quickly as possible. Others, who had experienced the worst brutalities of slavery, wanted revenge. They wanted the planters to feel fear, to experience just a fraction of the terror that enslaved people lived with every day. Jemmy took a middle position: they would kill when necessary for the success of the rebellion, but they would not kill indiscriminately. Men known to be particularly cruel would die. But they might spare those who had shown even minimal decency. This wasn't mercy, it was strategy. If word spread that rebels spared good masters, it might cause some planters to hesitate before counterattacking, and it would demonstrate that the rebels were rational actors, not simply a murderous mob. If they reached Florida, the Spanish would protect them. They would be free. Some might serve as soldiers at Fort Mose, defending Spanish territory against English incursions. Others might become farmers, traders, craftsmen, whatever they chose. The crucial thing was they would be free. It was a dream that sustained them through months of planning and waiting. Recruiting for a slave rebellion was extraordinarily dangerous. Every person you told was a potential betrayer. The Carolina authorities offered rewards for information about conspiracies. Some enslaved people, broken by years of brutality or desperate to protect themselves and their families, might inform on the plot. The conspirators had to be extremely selective about who they approached and how. The inner circle expanded slowly, very slowly. A man would be observed for weeks or months before being approached. The conspirators looked for subtle signs: How did he react when punished unjustly? Did his eyes show fire or resignation? Did he still carry himself with pride? Did he talk about Africa, about his life before enslavement? The actual recruitment happened in stages. First, there would be casual conversations about freedom, about Florida, about the Spanish decree. These conversations tested the person's receptivity to radical ideas. If they seemed interested, the conversations became more specific. If they seemed hesitant or frightened, the topic was dropped and never raised again. Only after weeks of careful probing would someone be told about the actual plan. And even then, most recruits weren't told everything. They knew there would be a rebellion soon, that it would involve marching to Florida, that they should be ready. But they didn't know the exact date or the specific details. That information was held by the inner circle alone. This compartmentalization was crucial for security. If someone was tortured by the authorities, they could only reveal what they knew, and most recruits knew very little. Not everyone who was approached wanted to join. Some were too frightened. They had seen what happened to failed runaways, and they couldn't bear the thought of that happening to them or their families. Some had children and couldn't risk leaving them behind or endangering them by taking them on a rebellion that would likely end in death. Some had been so thoroughly broken by slavery that they couldn't imagine freedom anymore. The system had crushed their spirits. They had survived by accepting their lot, by not hoping for anything better, by making themselves numb to the horror of their condition. The conspirators couldn't force anyone to join because that would be counterproductive and dangerous. But they did extract promises of silence. Don't join us, but don't betray us either. Most agreed, bound by the solidarity of shared suffering even if they couldn't bring themselves to fight. The historical records don't tell us much about the role of enslaved women in the Stono conspiracy, but they must have been involved at some level. Women did much of the cooking in the slave quarters. They worked in the plantation houses and overheard conversations that men working in the fields never heard. They moved between plantations as midwives and nurses. They were part of the communication networks. Some women certainly knew about the conspiracy and supported it, even if they didn't plan to march with the men. They might have passed messages, stolen weapons or supplies, provided intelligence about overseer movements and patrol schedules. But the plan focused on able-bodied men because the journey to Florida would be a forced march through hostile territory, probably involving combat. Women with small children couldn't make such a journey. The conspirators faced a terrible choice: leave families behind or bring them and endanger the entire enterprise. Most chose to go without their families, believing that if they reached Florida successfully, they might someday be able to bring their families to join them. It was a fragile hope, but hope was all they had. By late summer 1739, the conspiracy was as ready as it would ever be. They had recruited dozens of men across multiple plantations. They had scouts watching the store where they would get weapons. They had planned their route to Florida. They had stored small caches of food and supplies. Now they just had to wait for the right moment. The conspirators followed the news eagerly, insofar as enslaved people could follow news. They listened to fragments of conversation they overheard, to gossip from house servants who heard their masters talking, to newspapers that literate free black people might read and pass along. They were waiting for war between England and Spain to be declared officially. Once war began, the Carolina militia would be mobilized to defend against Spanish attack. The colony's defensive attention would be focused on the coast and the frontier. That would be the moment to strike. But waiting was agonizing. Every day they waited was another day the conspiracy might be exposed. Every conversation carried the risk of betrayal. Every time someone was punished or sold away, there was the fear they might talk. Jemmy felt the weight of all these waiting men looking to him for leadership. He had fought in African wars, but this was different. In Africa, he had fought for kings and chiefs. Now he was fighting for himself, for his people, for the radical idea that they had the right to be free. He thought about what would happen if they failed. He would be tortured, certainly. They would want to know who else was involved, and they would use every brutal method to extract that information. He steeled himself for that possibility. He would die before betraying his people. But he also thought about what would happen if they succeeded. He imagined walking into Fort Mose as a free man. He imagined being addressed by his true name, his African name, not the slave name Jemmy that had been forced upon him. He imagined having the choice about where to go, what to do, how to live. That dream kept him going through the waiting. In early September 1739, word reached the conspirators that war between England and Spain was imminent. The colonial government was preparing to mobilize militia forces. Ships were being outfitted in Charlestown harbor. Tensions were running high. It was time. Jemmy called a meeting of the inner circle. They gathered in the woods late at night, in a spot they had scouted carefully to ensure they wouldn't be disturbed. The meeting was brief, they couldn't risk being found together. Sunday, Jemmy told them. September 9th. We strike at dawn. The men nodded. This was what they had been preparing for. There was no turning back now. Over the next few days, word spread through the network to the wider group of recruits. The message was simple: Sunday. Be ready. Some of the conspirators put their affairs in order as much as any enslaved person could. They said goodbye to loved ones without saying goodbye. They couldn't reveal the plan, but they could hold their children a little longer, kiss their wives with extra tenderness, look at familiar places as if memorizing them. Some prayed to African gods, to the Christian God they had been taught about, to whatever powers might listen. They prayed for success, for freedom, for courage. They prayed that if they died, they would die as men, not as slaves. The conspirators couldn't sleep much in those final nights. They lay in their quarters, listening to the sounds of the plantation, the guards making their rounds, the dogs barking, the insects singing, the occasional cry of a child. Jemmy, lying in the darkness, thought about all the paths that had led him to this moment. He thought about his childhood in Africa, about his training as a warrior, about the day he was captured, about the horror of the Middle Passage, about 7 years of back-breaking labor in the rice fields, and he thought about tomorrow. Tomorrow, he would be free or he would be dead. Either way, he would never be a slave again. Jemmy woke in the darkness of the slave quarters, his heart already pounding. He hadn't really slept, just dozed fitfully, his body tense with anticipation. Around him, he could hear the breathing and occasional snores of other enslaved people, packed together in the crude wooden structure that served as their housing. He rose silently, stepping carefully over sleeping bodies. The quarters were arranged so that maximum people could be housed in minimum space, pure efficiency from the planter's perspective, degrading overcrowding from anyone else's. But this morning, Jemmy was grateful for the darkness and closeness. It meant he could move without attracting attention. Outside, the September air was still warm but carried a hint of coolness that promised the coming change of seasons. The stars were brilliant overhead, unmarred by any artificial light. Jemmy looked up at them for a moment, wondering if these were the same stars that shone over Africa. He had heard educated people say that the stars were the same everywhere on Earth, though they looked different depending on where you stood. It was a comforting thought that something connected him to his homeland across all that water. He made his way to the prearranged meeting spot, a small clearing about a quarter mile from the quarters, screened by trees and undergrowth. The others were already gathering, silent shadows materializing out of the darkness. Jemmy counted them as they arrived. 12 men in the inner circle, the leaders who knew the full plan. Not all of them came from the same plantation, some had risked traveling through the night to be here. Each of them had been chosen carefully over months of observation and conversation. When everyone had arrived, Jemmy spoke in a low voice, mixing English with Kikongo and other African languages. The men understood him, they had grown skilled at this kind of multilingual communication, necessity teaching them what formal education never would have. Today we become free or we die, he said simply. There is no middle path. Once we begin, the only way forward is to Florida or to death. The men nodded. They had all accepted this truth long ago. Jemmy reviewed the plan one final time. We move on to Hutchinson's store at first light. Silence until then. Speed is everything. We get the weapons, we get supplies, and then we march. The drums call others to us. We move fast, strike hard, and don't stop until we reach Spanish territory. One of the men, the Coromantee warrior, spoke up, and if we're pursued before we reach Florida? Then we fight, Jemmy said. We are warriors. We have all fought before. We can fight again. Another man asked about tactics. How would they organize themselves once they had weapons? How would they defend against mounted militia? How would they manage the march? Jemmy had thought through all of this. We keep a tight formation, like an army. Scouts ahead and on the flanks. Armed men on the outside, unarmed in the center. We rest only when we must, move as fast as the slowest person can manage. If we're attacked, we form squares and fight back. We show them we're not a rabble, we're an army. It was audacious to call a group of enslaved people an army, but Jemmy was deadly serious. He knew from his African military experience that discipline and organization could allow a smaller force to defeat a larger one. If they moved and fought like an army, they might survive. The meeting broke up as dawn approached. The men couldn't all travel together to the store, that would attract too much attention. Instead, they would approach separately or in pairs, gathering near the store just before the attack. Jemmy was the last to leave the clearing. He stood there for a moment, looking back at the plantation where he had labored for 7 years. He felt no attachment to it, only hatred. But he also felt a strange sense of finality, as if he were looking at something that belonged to his past, not his future. He would never work in those rice fields again. He would never sleep in those quarters again. He would never bow his head to an overseer again. Whatever happened today, that part of his life was over. He started walking toward the Stono River bridge. The store was about 3 miles away. He had time to get there before the sun came up. Robert Hutchinson's store was a modest structure, typical of the rural establishments that dotted the Carolina backcountry. It served the plantation owners and small farmers in the area, selling basic supplies, tools, and crucially for the conspirators, firearms and ammunition. The store sat near a bridge over the western branch of the Stono River, at a crossroads where the main road south intersected with a local plantation road. It was an ideal location for commerce and, as it turned out, for rebellion. As the sky began to lighten from black to dark blue, figures emerged from various directions, converging on the store. They moved casually, as if their presence here was perfectly natural. Enslaved people were often sent by their masters to pick up supplies, after all. But each of them carried the same coiled tension, the same awareness that everything was about to change. Jemmy arrived and assessed the situation. 20 men had gathered, the core of the rebellion. Some carried tools that could double as weapons, axes, machetes, heavy sticks. But they needed real weapons, guns, if this was going to work. The store was still closed, no lights visible inside. Hutchinson probably wasn't awake yet. The conspirators positioned themselves around the building, ready to move the moment Jemmy gave the signal. As they waited, the reality of what they were about to do settled over them. In a few minutes, they would cross a line that could never be uncrossed. They would take up arms against their enslavers. They would become rebels, outlaws, marked men. The full power of the colonial government would be turned against them. But they had accepted this. They were ready. The door to the store wasn't locked. People in the backcountry didn't worry much about theft, confident that the slave codes and patrols kept the enslaved population under control. That confidence was about to be shattered. Jemmy gave a nod, and 4 men rushed to the door. It burst open with a crash that shattered the morning quiet. The rest of the group poured in behind them. Robert Hutchinson, who had been sleeping in a back room, woke to chaos. He stumbled into the main store area, confused and terrified, to find 20 armed men ransacking his merchandise. "What?" he started to say. He never finished the sentence. The Coromantee warrior struck him down with a machete. Hutchinson fell, blood spreading across the wooden floor. He wasn't dead yet, but he was dying. There was a moment of terrible silence as everyone absorbed what had just happened. This was the first blood, the first killing. There was no going back now. Then the moment passed and practical matters took over. The conspirators systematically looted the store, taking every weapon they could find: muskets, pistols, powder horns, shot, knives. There weren't as many weapons as they had hoped, maybe a dozen firearms total, but it was enough to start with. They took food, too, and anything else that might be useful on the march. One young rebel found Hutchinson's money box and broke it open. But Jemmy shook his head. "We're not thieves," he said. "We're soldiers fighting for our freedom. Leave the money." It was an important distinction to him, even in the chaos. They weren't criminals. They were rebels, freedom fighters. There was honor in that, or at least there could be if they conducted themselves with dignity. As the rebels were finishing their looting of the store, they heard the sound of a horse approaching. A man on horseback was riding toward the store, probably planning to make some purchases before starting his Sunday routine. His name was Godfrey, a small planter who owned land nearby. He rounded the bend in the road and saw the rebels emerging from the store with weapons. For a second, he froze, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing: enslaved men, armed, at Hutchinson's store. Then he understood, and terror seized him. He tried to will his horse around to flee. He didn't make it. Several rebels fired their newly acquired muskets. The shots were poorly aimed. Most of these men had never fired a gun before, but one bullet struck Godfrey. He fell from his horse, mortally wounded. The rebels surrounded him. Godfrey was still conscious, gasping in pain and fear. Blood stained his fine Sunday clothes. He had been dressed for church. "Please," he whispered. "I have a family. Children." The Coromantee warrior raised his weapon. "So did I," he said in his heavily accented English. "Before I was taken." The blow was swift. Godfrey died on the road, his horse running off in panic. Jemmy felt a coldness settle over him. 2 men are dead now. The rebellion had begun in earnest, and blood marked their path. He pushed aside any feelings of doubt or regret. This was war, and in war, people died. The planters had made war on Africans for decades, stealing them from their homes, working them to death in the rice fields. Now the war was coming to the planters' doorstep. "Take his horse," Jemmy commanded. "We need to move." The rebels assembled on the road south of the store. 20 men, now armed with muskets, pistols, and blades. The morning sun was beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It would have been beautiful under other circumstances. One of the men had found drums in Hutchinson's store, not African drums, but military drums of the type used by European armies. Close enough. He began to beat a rhythm, steady and insistent. Boom. Boom. Boom boom boom. The sound carried across the flat low-country landscape, echoing off the trees and water. Other rebels joined in, beating out complementary rhythms. The sound was African in spirit even if the instruments were European: a calling rhythm, a war rhythm, a freedom rhythm. "Liberty!" Jemmy shouted, raising his musket. "Liberty!" The others took up the cry. "Liberty! Liberty! Liberty!" It was an English word, but they imbued it with meanings the English colonists would never fully understand. Liberty wasn't just an abstract political concept to them. It was the ability to walk where you wanted, to keep what you earned, to protect your family, to live without the constant threat of violence and violation. It was the restoration of their humanity. They began to march south, toward Georgia and Florida. The drums beat constantly, announcing their presence to anyone within earshot. On plantations within a mile of the road, enslaved people working their small Sunday garden plots or preparing breakfast heard the drums. At first, they weren't sure what they were hearing. Drums were forbidden in most places, and the sound was unexpected. Then they heard the shouting, "Liberty! Liberty! Come join us! We march to Florida!" Hearts began to pound. Was this real? Was this the rebellion they had whispered about, the uprising they had dreamed of but never quite believed would happen? On the Middleton plantation, a man named Quamino dropped his hoe and ran toward the road. His wife called after him, terrified, but he didn't stop. He had been plotting his escape for years, waiting for the right moment. This was it. On the Izzard plantation, 3 brothers heard the drums and looked at each other. No words were necessary. They had discussed this possibility many times. Together, they started running toward the sound. On the Gibby's plantation, an older man who had been enslaved for 30 years sat down and wept. He was too old, too broken to join them. But he prayed for their success with an intensity that surprised him. He hadn't prayed in years, slavery had beaten the faith out of him. But now he prayed. Not everyone joined. Some were paralyzed by fear. Some had small children and couldn't risk taking them or leaving them. Some had been so thoroughly traumatized by slavery that they couldn't conceive of resistance, only survival through submission. But dozens did join. Men came running from the fields, emerging from slave quarters, appearing from the woods. Each new recruit was quickly assessed by the leaders. Did they look strong enough for the march? Did they seem trustworthy, or might they be informers? Most were welcomed. A few were turned away because they seemed unreliable or too young. By the time the rebel column had marched a mile, it had grown to 40 men. The rebel column approached the Godfrey plantation, the property of the man they had killed on the road. The decision had been made: they would attack plantations as they marched, both to eliminate threats and to acquire more weapons and supplies. The Godfrey house was a modest wooden structure, 2 stories, with separate kitchen buildings and slave quarters behind it. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney. The household was awake, preparing for the Sunday morning routine. Jemmy split his force. Half would attack the house directly. The other half would secure the quarters and prevent anyone from fleeing to raise the alarm. Mrs. Godfrey, a woman in her 30s, was in the parlor when she heard the commotion. She looked out the window and saw armed black men approaching the house. She screamed. Her scream was cut short as the rebels burst through the door. What happened next was brutal and swift. The historical records don't provide details, only the fact that the Godfrey family, Mrs. Godfrey and her 2 children, were killed. These were the families of slaveholders, the beneficiaries of a system built on brutality. The Godfreys had lived in comfort because people like Jemmy labored in chains. Their children had eaten food harvested by enslaved hands. Their very existence was predicated on the destruction of African families. Still, the killing of children troubled some of the rebels. One young man, who had joined the march only an hour before, turned away, his face pale. This was more violence than he had prepared himself for. Jemmy noticed. "This is war," he said firmly. "In war, people die. If we show mercy, we will be crushed. They show us no mercy." The young man nodded but didn't look convinced. War was easier to contemplate than to execute. As the rebel column continued south, it grew steadily. By 8 in the morning, nearly 60 men had joined the march. The column was becoming unwieldy, difficult to control. Many of the new recruits had no weapons, just tools and determination. They approached the Wallace plantation. But as they did, Jemmy called a halt. "This one we spare," he announced. There were murmurs of confusion and some anger. "Why spare any of them?" Jemmy explained, "Wallace is known to treat his people less harshly. He doesn't use the whip as readily as others. We show that we are not savages, that we have honor, that we can distinguish between the cruel and the less cruel." It was a calculated decision. Jemmy understood that if word spread that the rebels spared decent masters, it might cause some planters to hesitate before joining the militia pursuing them. It might also win sympathy from some quarters. There were people in the colonies, though few, who opposed slavery or at least its worst excesses. But many of the rebels were angry. They had suffered under the system, and they wanted revenge on all who benefited from it. A fierce debate broke out, with some arguing they should attack the Wallace plantation anyway. Jemmy stood firm. He was the acknowledged leader, and his military experience gave him authority. "We spare this one," he repeated. "That is my command." The column moved on, leaving the Wallace plantation untouched. Thomas Wallace, watching from his window, would later testify that the rebels had spared him deliberately, a fact that complicated the colonial narrative of mindless violence. The rebel column was now stretching along the road, a ragged but determined procession. At the front, Jemmy and the other leaders maintained discipline as best they could. The drums continued their insistent rhythm. Men shouted liberty, periodically, their voices hoarse with emotion. Some of the newer recruits were already flagging. They had grabbed what food they could, but many had eaten nothing that morning and the march was demanding. Still, they pressed on, driven by the intoxicating possibility of freedom. Scouts ranged ahead into the sides, watching for any sign of organized opposition. So far, they had encountered only individual planters and their families, easily overwhelmed. But they knew it couldn't last. Word of the rebellion would reach Charlestown soon, if it hadn't already. The militia would be mobilizing. Another attack, another plantation. The Lamey family was targeted next. Historical records indicate that the Lameys were killed, though details are sparse. What is clear is that by mid-morning, the rebel column had attacked at least 4 plantations, killing approximately 15 white colonists. With each attack, the rebels acquired a few more weapons, a musket here, a pistol there, powder and shot. They also took food, tools, and anything else that might be useful. But the attacks were also slowing them down. Every stop meant precious time lost, time that allowed the militia to organize. Jemmy was acutely aware of this dilemma. They needed weapons, but they also needed speed. He made a decision: they would launch no more attacks unless absolutely necessary. From this point forward, they would focus on reaching Florida as quickly as possible. William Bull, the lieutenant governor of South Carolina, was traveling on the main road from Charlestown to his plantation when he encountered something that would haunt him for the rest of his life: the rebel column. Bull and his small party rounded a bend and suddenly found themselves facing 60 armed black men marching in formation, drums beating, muskets on their shoulders. For a moment, everyone froze, predator and prey locked in mutual recognition. Bull's training as a colonial official kicked in. He didn't try to confront them, that would have been suicide. He didn't try to negotiate, what could he say? Instead, he wheeled his horse around and rode as hard as he could toward Charlestown. Behind him, some of the rebels raised their muskets, but Jemmy ordered them not to fire. "Let him go," he commanded. "We need every shot for what's coming." It was a pragmatic decision, but it may have sealed the rebellion's fate. Bull rode like a man possessed, covering the miles back to Charlestown in record time, spreading the alarm at every plantation he passed. "Rebellion," he shouted. "Armed slaves marching south. Raise the militia." When Bull reached Charlestown, the city erupted in panic. Church services were interrupted as riders burst in with news of the uprising. The alarm bells began to ring, their frantic pealing sending a clear message: danger, emergency, all hands needed. Men rushed home to arm themselves. The militia companies began to muster. Plantation owners in the city sent urgent messages to their overseers: secure the slaves, double the guards, and prevent any word of the rebellion from spreading. The white population of Charlestown had always lived with the fear of slave rebellion. They were outnumbered by the people they enslaved, and they knew it. Every harsh punishment, every act of cruelty, every separation of families had been underpinned by the knowledge that the enslaved population had every reason to hate them. Now their worst nightmare was coming true. Messengers rode out in every direction, alerting plantations and calling for the militia to assemble. The colonial government moved into an emergency session. Governor James Glenn, though not in the city at that moment, would soon be informed. The machinery of colonial power began to turn, slowly but with crushing force. Throughout the Lowcountry, militia companies received the call to arms. The South Carolina militia system was designed precisely for this kind of emergency, not to fight external enemies, though they could do that too, but primarily to suppress slave rebellions and control the enslaved population. Every white man between the ages of 16 and 60 was required to be part of the militia. They were supposed to maintain their own weapons and ammunition, to drill regularly, and to respond immediately when called. The reality was that many didn't take their militia duties very seriously in peacetime, but the threat of slave rebellion concentrated their minds wonderfully. Now they came, riding from plantations across St. Paul's Parish and beyond. Some were wealthy planters, mounted on fine horses and carrying expensive firearms. Others were poor whites, walking and carrying old muskets that might not even fire properly. But they were united by race and by fear. The assembly point was a plantation near the Stono River, several miles north of where the rebels had last been sighted. The militia captains began organizing their men, assigning positions, trying to impose military order on what was essentially an armed mob. By late morning, nearly 100 militia members had assembled, with more arriving every few minutes. They outnumbered the rebels, and they were better armed and trained. But they were also cautious. Everyone had heard stories of slave rebellions in the Caribbean where outnumbered whites had been massacred. No one wanted to be the first to die. By mid-morning, the rebel column had covered about 10 miles from Hutchinson's store. They had been marching for nearly 5 hours, and exhaustion was beginning to set in. Many of the rebels had eaten little or nothing. The September sun was climbing higher, and the heat was becoming oppressive. More critically, the column was starting to fragment. The newest recruits, many of whom had joined on impulse without fully understanding what they were committing to, were having second thoughts. Some were slipping away, disappearing into the woods. Others were falling behind, unable to maintain the pace. Jemmy called a halt near a field by the Edisto River. It was a strategic mistake, one born of exhaustion and the challenge of leading a group that was more mob than army. But the rebels needed to rest, to eat, to regroup. 1 hour, Jemmy announced. We rest for 1 hour, then we march again. We must reach Florida before the militia catches us. But even as he said it, he could see that many of the men were in no condition to march further immediately. They sprawled on the ground, gasping, drinking from the river, passing around what little food they had. As the rebels rested, a debate broke out about what to do next. The leadership was fracturing under the strain. One faction, led by the Coromantee warrior, argued that they should abandon the march to Florida and instead attack Charlestown itself. We have momentum, he argued. More slaves will join us. We can take the city, burn it to the ground, kill all the slave owners. Then we control the colony. It was an audacious proposal, but utterly unrealistic. Charlestown was fortified, garrisoned, and by now fully alert to the danger. An attack on the city would be suicide. Jemmy argued strenuously against this plan. We cannot take Charlestown with 60 men, he said. We would be slaughtered. Our only hope is to reach Florida, where the Spanish will protect us. Another faction argued that they should scatter into the swamps and forests, breaking up into small groups that would be harder to track. They could live as Maroons, hiding in the wilderness, raiding plantations for supplies. And then what? Jemmy demanded. Live like animals in the swamps forever? That's not freedom. That's just a different kind of prison. But the real problem was that many of the rebels were simply celebrating. They had struck a blow against their oppressors. They had tasted freedom, even if only for a few hours. Some had found liquor at the plantations they had attacked, and they were drinking, dancing, drumming. The drums had changed from a call to arms to a celebration. Men were dancing African dances, singing songs in their native languages, releasing years of pent-up emotion. Jemmy watched this with a growing alarm. They needed to be marching, not celebrating. Every minute they wasted was a minute closer to the militia catching them. We need to move, he shouted. Now. The militia is coming. But his authority was slipping. Some men ignored him, too caught up in the moment. Others were too exhausted to move. The tight military discipline of the early morning was dissolving into chaos. The militia had organized itself into a formidable force. Nearly 150 men now, mounted and on foot, with more still arriving. They had more weapons than they could easily carry, and some had brought dogs trained to track runaway slaves. The militia captains had been receiving regular intelligence about the rebels' progress. Survivors from the attacked plantations had made their way to the militia's assembly point, providing information about the rebels' numbers, their weapons, and their direction of march. The militia knew they had advantages. They outnumbered the rebels. They were better armed. They were fresh, while the rebels had been marching for hours. And they had the advantage of righteous fury, or at least, fury that felt righteous to them. These rebels had killed white women and children. They had attacked the very foundations of colonial society. But the militia was also cautious. They knew that cornered men fought desperately, and the rebels were certainly cornered. The militia captains decided on a strategy: track the rebels, wait for reinforcements to arrive, then attack with overwhelming force. They began to move south, following the trail the rebels had left. It wasn't difficult to track, a column of 60 men moving along the main road, stopping at plantations, beating drums. They might as well have left signs. By early afternoon, the militia was closing in on the rebel position. They could hear the drums in the distance, that African rhythm that so terrified white colonists. To the militia, those drums represented everything they feared about the enslaved population: a foreign culture they couldn't control, a capacity for violence they couldn't suppress, a desire for freedom they couldn't comprehend. The militia captains sent scouts ahead to assess the rebel position. The scouts reported back: the rebels were resting in a field near the Stono River. They seemed disorganized, many of them drinking and dancing. It was the opportunity the militia had been hoping for. The militia formed up for attack. The mounted men would charge first, breaking the rebel formation. The infantry would follow, firing volleys into the rebels, then closing with bayonets and clubs. Some of the militia members were nervous. These weren't trained soldiers, they were planters, overseers, small farmers, merchants. Most had never been in combat. But they had spent their entire lives being taught that they were superior to black people, that enslaved Africans were subhuman, that the racial hierarchy was natural and ordained by God. Now they were about to test those beliefs in blood. The militia captains gave final instructions: show no mercy. They have killed our families. We will kill them all. Any man who survives will face torture and execution. We will break this rebellion utterly. The first the rebels knew of the militia's presence was the thunder of hooves. The mounted militia burst from the tree line, charging across the field toward the rebel position. For a moment, the rebels were caught completely off guard. They had been celebrating, drinking, letting their guard down. Now death was riding toward them. Form up! Form up! Jemmy shouted, trying to impose order on chaos. Some of the rebels responded immediately, grabbing their weapons and forming a defensive line. These were the veterans, the men with military experience, the ones who had been in the inner circle of the conspiracy. They moved with trained efficiency, creating a formation that could deliver concentrated fire. Others panicked. Some tried to run. Some froze in place, overwhelmed by terror. Some fumbled with weapons they didn't know how to use properly. The mounted militia crashed into the rebel formation like a hammer. Men were trampled, shot at point-blank range, cut down with swords. The rebels fired back, and several militia members fell from their horses, but the momentum of the charge was devastating. Jemmy rallied his fighters with remarkable courage. Despite being outnumbered and caught off guard, despite the chaos and terror, he managed to organize a defensive position. Tight formation, he shouted. Fire by ranks. Reload and fire again. The Coromantee warrior stood beside him, firing his musket with deadly accuracy. He had been a soldier in Africa, and those skills had not left him. Each shot he fired dropped a militia member. Other rebels formed around these two leaders, creating a core of resistance. They fired volley after volley into the attacking militia, slowing the charge. For a brief moment, it seemed like they might hold. The militia's initial charge had been repulsed with significant losses. The rebels had shown they could fight, that they weren't simply going to be slaughtered like sheep. But the militia had numbers and kept coming. Wave after wave of armed white men, driven by fear and fury, pressed the attack. The rebels' ammunition was running low. They had started the day with limited powder and shot, and the intense firefight was exhausting their supplies. Jemmy could see the situation deteriorating. Men were falling around him, killed or wounded. The defensive formation was starting to fragment. "Fall back," he ordered. "To the river." We fall back to the river. It was a fighting withdrawal, the hardest military maneuver to execute. The rebels had to fire, move back, reload, fire again, all while under constant attack. Men were dying with every step. The Coromantee warrior was hit, a musket ball slamming into his chest. He fell to his knees, blood spreading across his shirt. He looked up at Jemmy, his eyes still fierce. "Go," he gasped. "Get to Florida. Tell them we fought." Then he collapsed. Jemmy had no time to mourn. He grabbed the warrior's weapon and continued fighting. The rebel formation finally collapsed completely. What had been an organized military unit became a desperate mob of men trying to survive. They scattered in all directions, some running for the woods, some trying to swim across the river, some turning to make final stands where they stood. The militia showed no mercy. They had lost men in the fighting, some were between 10 and 20 killed, many more wounded, and they wanted revenge. Rebels who tried to surrender were shot down. Rebels who begged for mercy were clubbed to death. Jemmy found himself surrounded by 5 militia members. He was out of ammunition, his musket empty. He reversed it, holding it like a club, and prepared to sell his life dearly. "Come on," he roared in Kakongo. "Come and die." The militia men rushed him. Jemmy fought like a lion, swinging his musket like a war club, using techniques he had learned as a young warrior in Africa. He broke one man's arm, caved in another's skull. But there were too many of them. A musket ball hit him in the leg. He stumbled. Another shot hit his shoulder. He fell to his knees, blood pouring from his wounds. The last thing Jemmy saw was the butt of a musket swinging toward his head. Then darkness. When the fighting finally ended, the field was covered with bodies. The militia had won a decisive victory, but at significant cost. Between 10 and 20 militia members lay dead, with many more wounded. For a colonial society with a small white population, these were serious losses. But the rebel losses were catastrophic. At least 40 rebels lay dead on the field. Some had been killed in combat. Others had been executed after trying to surrender. The militia was in no mood for mercy. The wounded rebels faced terrible fates. Colonial law prescribed brutal punishments for slave rebellion, and the militia members were determined to make examples. Several wounded rebels were tortured on the spot, as warnings to anyone else who might contemplate rebellion. Jemmy was found among the dead or dying. The historical record is unclear about exactly when he died. He may have bled out from his wounds. He may have been executed. But either way, the leader of the rebellion was dead. His body, like those of other identified leaders, was decapitated. His head would be mounted on a pole along the main road, a grim warning to the enslaved population. Not all the rebels had died in the battle. Perhaps 20 had managed to escape into the woods and swamps. The militia immediately organized pursuit parties, bringing dogs to track the fugitives. Some of the escaping rebels were captured within hours, dragged from hiding places in the forest or pulled from the river. They faced immediate execution, their bodies left where they fell as warnings. But a few managed to evade capture, at least temporarily. They melted into the lowcountry wilderness, moving through swamps where the militia members wouldn't follow, using knowledge of the terrain that enslaved people accumulated through years of working the land. One group of 3 men made it more than 30 miles south before being captured. They were returned to St. Paul's Parish in chains, where they faced public execution. Another rebel, a man whose name doesn't appear in the records, apparently did make it to Florida. Spanish records from several months later mention an English-speaking black man arriving at St. Augustine with stories of a great uprising. Whether he was from Stono or another rebellion is unclear, but the timing suggests he might have been. As evening fell, the militia began the journey back north, carrying their dead and wounded. They also drove before them a group of captured rebels, perhaps a dozen men, chained together, destined for execution. The militia members were exhausted, bloodied, traumatized by the violence they had witnessed and committed. But they were also relieved and even celebratory. They had crushed the rebellion. They had maintained white supremacy. They had protected the system that made them, if not wealthy, at least better off than the enslaved population. As they marched, they began to construct a narrative of what had happened. In this narrative, they were heroes who had defended their families and civilization against savage rebels. The brutality of slavery that had provoked the rebellion was forgotten. The rebels' courage and organization were minimized. Instead, they told themselves and each other a simple story: good had triumphed over evil. The battle had broken the rebellion, but the manhunt continued for weeks. Every enslaved person in St. Paul's Parish was suspect. Militia patrols ranged across the countryside, searching for fugitives and anyone who might have supported the rebellion. Enslaved people who had nothing to do with the uprising found themselves interrogated, beaten, threatened. The militia and slave patrols were looking for anyone who showed the slightest sign of rebellious sentiment. Some of the captured fugitives were tortured to extract information about the conspiracy. The militia wanted to know, who else was involved? How long had this been planned? Were there other conspiracies brewing? The captives revealed little, either because they didn't know much, the conspiracy had been carefully compartmentalized, or because they refused to betray their fellows even under torture. The executions of captured rebels were public spectacles designed to terrorize the enslaved population. They took place along the main roads, at prominent locations where everyone could see. The condemned men were brought out in chains. They were given no trial. Slave codes didn't provide for trials in cases of armed rebellion. The sentence was death, and it was carried out immediately. But the deaths weren't quick. Colonial authorities wanted maximum deterrent effect. Some men were hanged and then their bodies were burned. Others were broken on the wheel, a horrific punishment where victims' bones were systematically crushed. Some were simply shot, which was almost merciful by comparison. And then the heads. The decapitated heads of the rebellion leaders and random captured rebels were mounted on poles along the main roads. They stayed there for months, rotting in the Carolina sun, being picked at by carrion birds, becoming increasingly skeletal and horrific. Every enslaved person who walked or was transported along those roads saw those heads. The message was clear: this is what rebellion brings. This is the price of seeking freedom. The colonial government launched extensive investigations into the rebellion. They wanted to understand how it had happened, how it had been organized, what had allowed it to get as far as it did. Lieutenant Governor William Bull submitted detailed reports. Plantation owners were questioned about the behavior of their enslaved workers in the days and weeks before the rebellion. Anyone who had shown signs of unusual activity or unusual freedom of movement came under scrutiny. The investigations revealed the extent of the conspiracy. It had involved dozens of people across multiple plantations, had been planned for months, and had shown remarkable organization. This was deeply disturbing to colonial authorities. It suggested that enslaved people were capable of sophisticated planning and coordination, contradicting the racist ideology that portrayed them as simple-minded and incapable of complex thought. The South Carolina Colonial Assembly responded to Stono by passing comprehensive new slave codes, collectively known as the Negro Act of 1740. These laws were among the harshest in the English colonies and represented a dramatic tightening of control over the enslaved population. Key provisions included prohibition on teaching literacy. It became illegal to teach enslaved people to read or write. The literacy ban reflected colonial fears that educated enslaved people were more dangerous, more capable of organizing resistance. Restrictions on assembly. Enslaved people were prohibited from assembling in groups, even for religious worship, without white supervision. This was designed to prevent the kind of secret meetings that had allowed the Stono conspiracy to develop. Prohibition on growing food. Enslaved people were forbidden from growing their own food, raising their own livestock, or earning money. This was designed to make them completely dependent on their owners for survival, eliminating any economic independence. Restrictions on movement. The pass system was strengthened. Any enslaved person found off their plantation without a written pass could be punished, and any white person who encountered such an individual was legally obligated to detain them. Prohibition on drums and horns. The use of drums, horns, and other loud instruments by enslaved people was banned. The colonists had heard the drums of Stono and understood that they could be used for communication and coordination. Mandatory militia service. All white men between 16 and 60 were required to perform regular militia duty. Patrol duties were increased, with armed white men regularly patrolling roads and plantations at night. Limitations on manumission. It became much more difficult for slave owners to free their enslaved workers. The colonial government wanted to prevent the growth of a free black population that might support or sympathize with rebellions. Regulation of slave trade. Ironically, the act also included some restrictions on the importation of new enslaved Africans. The colonial government feared that too many recently arrived Africans, who still remembered freedom and had not been broken by years of slavery, made the colony more vulnerable to rebellion. They preferred to import enslaved people who had been born into bondage or had been enslaved for many years. The Negro Act remained in force, with modifications, until the end of slavery in South Carolina. It became a model for slave codes in other southern colonies and states. South Carolina also invested heavily in its military infrastructure after Stono. New militia armories were built. Patrols were professionalized. Fort construction accelerated, both to defend against external enemies and to provide strong points in case of slave rebellion. The colonial government even considered a proposal to build a massive fortified line across the middle of the colony, separating the heavily enslaved lowcountry from the backcountry. The plan was never implemented due to cost, but the fact that it was seriously discussed shows how frightened the colonists had become. Within the enslaved community, Stono became a legend. The details were passed down through oral tradition, stories told in the quarters, songs encoded with meaning, memories preserved despite every attempt to suppress them. The rebellion demonstrated that resistance was possible. It showed that enslaved people could organize, could fight, could strike fear into their oppressors. Even though Stono had failed, even though the rebels had been crushed, most of them died for that freedom. Their heads were mounted on poles as warnings. The system they fought against continued for another 126 years. But their choice mattered. Their resistance mattered. They proved that enslaved people were not passive victims but active agents, capable of organization, courage, and sacrifice. The drums they beat on that September morning echoed through the generations. Denmark Vesey heard them. Nat Turner heard them. Frederick Douglass heard them. Harriet Tubman heard them. Martin Luther King Jr. heard them. We can still hear them today if we listen, not literally, of course, but in the ongoing struggle for freedom, justice, and human dignity. The specific circumstances change, but the fundamental human yearning for liberty remains constant. The Stono rebels didn't win their battle, but they were part of a war that eventually was won. And every generation that inherits their legacy has a choice. Will we honor their sacrifice by continuing their struggle for justice? Or will we forget them and accept the injustices of our own time? The drums still echo. The question is whether we have ears to hear them.